Well, I feel very honored to be here with you today to talk about my family. It is all about family. It's family, faith, and love. That is what the Burt carols and the Burt family carols are all about. My husband told me yesterday, he said, you know, you should really say that Alfred Burt is your grandfather and not your father. And Bates Burt could be your great-grandfather, because now they're going to know how old you are. But, you know, good food and lots of supplements and exercise, and I think I'm doing okay. So first of all, the tradition of writing a Christmas carol for a Christmas card began with my grandfather, the Reverend Bates Gilbert Burt. He was an Episcopal minister, and he had a parish in Marquette, Michigan, Upper Peninsula, right near the Lake Superior. In fact, the family had a home, a camp, if you will, they called them camps, on the lake that they would use in the summertime, and they called it Furigard. And so his family started there. Firstborn was Deborah, and I have a friend named Deborah. Deborah, she was firstborn, and then her brother, John, who became the Bishop of Ohio and was at All Saints Pasadena for the Episcopal Church. John was born 10 years later. My father was then born 2 years after that, so he was the baby. And so the family was always musical. My Aunt Deb, she was a piano teacher. Everyone sang. My grandfather, he was a what would you call it, a natural musician, self-taught. He didn't go to school for it, but he loved it, loved music, and loved Christmas. One thing he didn't particularly care for was the fact that the carols, the cards that you would get were very commercial. And he wanted something that was more tied to faith and personal. Personal for his friends and personal for his family. So when my dad was born, he was 2 years old when my grandfather, there's my grandfather, was moved to All Saints Pontiac Episcopal Church from Marquette. They still went back every summer to spend time at the lake, but that's where the new church was, and my father grew up. My father, according to a lot of people, was a child prodigy in terms of music. It was in his genes, his DNA. And so he, at an early age, showed proficiency in piano. He wanted to learn to play the cornet, and he kept asking the family for a cornet. And when he had an appendicitis at 10 years old, they offered him the cornet if he'd go to the hospital and have the appendix out. So, of course, when you have appendicitis, you can't blow a cornet. So he learned all the fingering. He had the book, and he just learned the fingering so that after he recovered, he could start to play. And he was an acolyte in the church. He was active in Sunday school and in the Young People's Society. And that is where he met my mother, Ann Short Burt. There she is. Anywho, my mom was actually a parishioner. My grandfather, we call him Grandpa Burt, he and my grandparents, my mother's parents, got together all the time out at Oxbow Lake nearby and would play cards and have dinner. So this was a relationship that my mom had as her minister and her church, and not just because of my dad. And as my mother said, my dad was a lousy boyfriend, but he was a really good husband. And that was because of the time, of course. They were busy. They were in Young People's Society together, and they would My dad started a dance band with his best friend Ray Nissiper, and my mom was a vocalist for the band. In fact, the three of them were together so much of the time, friends called them the Three Musty Steers. And they would do dances wherever and whenever anyone would talk about it. At one point, my father asked for a drum set, so they put that in the attic so that he could learn to play the drums. But as he grew up and was very involved in the church, as well as his schooling, he chose to go to the University of Michigan. And while he was there, he graduated as the outstanding music theory student. He was also a drum major for the famous marching band under Ravelli at the university. He was also with the symphony orchestra, and he was in Phi Mu Alpha fraternity. So he was very active. And this is the reason Mom said he wasn't the greatest boyfriend, because they couldn't always see each other. It was get together and then get back. Well, my mom went to Michigan State Normal College, is what it was called then. I think it's called Eastern Michigan. And she was going to be a Sunday school teacher, a second grade teacher, and was studying for her education in becoming a teacher. However, while she was there, she contracted an infection that got into her eye and took out her sight in that eye. Now, they did malaria therapy to get it back, and she did get it back, so she did have her sight, but that took her out of school. And these things all will intertwine in a few minutes as I tell you why. So we'll go to the next slide. In our church, there was a delightful organist named Willa Hudson, and she was with the All Saints Pontiac for quite some time, and she was a great friend of the family. And you know how on Christmas Eve, you've got Christmas Day services, so driving all the way from Pontiac to Detroit in a major snowstorm wasn't the greatest idea, so that she would stay over at the rectory and have time with the family. And every Christmas morning, there would be stocking gifts. And you had to write a poem to go with that gift. Didn't matter if you were my dad, my aunt, my grandmother, or Willa. And Willa wrote the best poems, nonstop. That was her nom de plume. She was also a composer of in her own right, and an exceptional organist. Wrote a lot of books about the interludes for the organ that are still used today. And she was quite taken with my father as far as his musical ability was concerned. He would write anthems and different music for the church services. And he was, a teenager and growing into his young manhood. So when he graduated from the University of Michigan, he was the one who my grandfather asked to write the music for the carols. Now, this was not the very first carol that the Burt family had written. My grandfather started writing a carol in the 1920s, 1923. So all that time, and my dad was growing up, my grandfather was putting the Christmas card together and the carol for that particular year. And so in 1942, that was the time when my grandfather said, well, now you're the professional musician in the family, so you write the music and I'll do the lyrics. Next. That is my Uncle John, my dad's brother. One more. I have to remember to remind him to change it. There's the Michigan Dance Band. Keep going. Aha. This is the cover. Oops. There's the cover of the very first carol. Now, it was November, and my father still hadn't written the music to the carol for that year. He and my mother were supposed to go to the Ford Sunday evening hour in Detroit to hear a band and hold hands up in the balcony. So my grandfather said to him, "Al, I have to get the carol to the printer." My grandfather had already found lyrics at a church bazaar, a tiny little book of Christmas poems by Father Andrew, who was a Catholic priest from London. Little tiny book that he bought at the bazaar, probably, I don't know, for 25 cents. And he was going to use those. Well, my father asked my mom, "Do you mind waiting a minute?" Well, she said, "You're driving. What can I do?" So she talked to my grandmother and father and grandfather, and he sat down in the living room with the piano, and in 15 minutes had written out the music for the first carol that he and father would do together. Father-son team had now started. That was in 1942. In 1943, of course, there was a whole generation that was dealing with the war coming on, and my grandfather was actually on the board of, I forgot what you called it back then. The draft board. My father was a conscientious objector. He was a pacifist. He did not believe in taking a life. But he struggled with the idea of how do you do this in a war that's taking over everything around us. And his father was so, he instigated a conversation with him about his feelings and about his faith and what did he want to do. Because he certainly didn't want to run off to Canada. Although my grandmother was from there and there was family, but no. So my father thought about it long and hard and then decided he would join the Army Air Force in the entertainment side, and he was in the Army band. So in 1943 and 1944, the Carol in Wartime was written while my father was away in Texas, in San Angelo, Texas, doing the dance bands, and they had a group called the Yardbirds that were playing at all the functions and within towns. Meanwhile, where's my mom? Well, I told you about the fact she lost her eyesight and couldn't go back to school. So she was interested in medicine a little bit, so she took a first aid class and thought, well, I can help somehow, volunteer, whatever. And they were looking for Navy waves to join the fight. And she went off to Hunter College in New York. My grandmother and my grandfather on my mom's side, Alton and Lillian, my grandfather was, "She can't go, they can't take her." And my grandmother Lillian said, "Don't worry about it. She'll never pass the eye exam." My mother came back sworn in and ready to go do her Navy wave training and work in San Diego. So mom's in San Diego, dad's in Texas, Grandpa Burt is sending lyrics off so dad can do the carols. And then after that whole year, my mom was moved to Great Lakes to set up the first aid and corps school for the Navy. So Great Lakes is not that far from Michigan. It's, a hop, skip, and a jump. Well, the 1945 carol ended up connecting the 44 carol, ended up connecting my mom and dad again because he sent one to her, found out where she was and sent one to her. So they corresponded, and mom was supposed to go home on a vacation to see her parents, but she made a slight detour. She went from Great Lakes near Chicago to San Angelo, Texas, saw my dad, they went to church, and she came back engaged. So she went all the way back up to Michigan. And so they were married in October of 1945. And my mom had gotten out of the Navy. My dad had not quite gotten out of the service, so they had to go back down to Texas to get that taken care of. But now it was a family that added my mom's name to the carol. And then that's when, in 1946, next one, oops, the Oblique and Chill came out, 45, excuse me, and then in 1946, the tradition continued. Grandpa writing the words, Dad doing the music, my mom now helping to coordinate some of the printing and that type of thing. But my father, as being able to write something as universal as a Christmas carol, his jazz background and his love of jazz is really what I think has made these carols timeless. And there are many, including my delightful husband, who has studied them way more than I have because he is a jazz musician and extraordinary in his own right, that it's the intricacies of the harmonies that have kept them going all these years. You know, it's fresh and sounds so wonderful when you hear those chords. So, of course, what would my dad do? He and his bandmates who got out of the service started a band with Hal Richards and started touring all over the country, and my mom was a vocalist, and my dad was playing trumpet and keyboard because he played piano as well, but didn't call himself a pianist. He thought trumpet was his thing. So they were traveling around. And then it was in 1946 for All on a Christmas Morning, and then in 1947 for Nigh Bethlehem, that they went back in the summer to the camp up in Lake Superior. And it was summertime, and my father had the music for the words ready. And my grandfather was thrilled because it was August. And he didn't have to wait until November to get it all put together. I think my dad was a little bit of a procrastinator here or there. I think I maybe inherited a small bit of that as well. So they played through the song, they sang through it, and it just made my grandfather beam to hear it. And it was in the summer at their beautiful home that they were staying up in the Upper Peninsula. Now, my father and mother went to New York to live for a short time, and my father worked at the American Theater Wing School, and he was teaching music theory and voice and other classes. And he actually helped Helen Jordan, who was very famous there and lived a very long time, to do a music theory book that he is a part of. My mom, because of her nursing skills from the wartime, she got a job in a doctor's office, helping the doctor. Now, I should mention, just to back up a moment, when my mom was in San Diego, she was trained as an operating room technician. So in nowadays culture and how the medical world lines up, she would have been considered a physician's assistant by the amount of schooling and the amount of experience. So she was considered a chief pharmacist mate, is what they called her. So she works in the operating room all during the day, sings with the dance band at night. She was called the Singing Wave. They used to ask her to go to the Golden Glove Awards, climb into the ring with a skirt on, and sing the national anthem. They gave her a little golden glove to wear because of what she had done. I think it's because she had to climb in there with a skirt, if you ask me. So anyway, all of this training, of course, followed her, and she was able to accept a position in New York, while my dad was trying to get into the union there so that he could work jobs, union jobs in New York. Well, in the following year, my grandfather was retired, and he was doing a relief position in Towson, Maryland, when he had a heart attack and died. And so they decided after the funeral, as they were riding the train back to New York, to figure out, all right, what are we going to do now? That is when they decided to continue the carol tradition and asked Willa Hudson, the church organist, to supply the lyrics because she did such beautiful poetry. And of course, Willa was thrilled. She just loved the idea because she left my dad. They had such a musical connection. The two of them would have long, long talks about different things in music, and she just really admired his work and how he had grown into this amazing man. So now Willa would provide the lyrics for them wherever they would go. However, in 1948, as they were just getting started when my grandfather died, Uncle John was in seminary in Virginia, and he had seen this old English rune of hospitality on Dean Zabrisky's wall and said, how about using this? And so they looked at it and they decided, okay, we'll use this old English rune. And it was something that my grandfather was very aware of, the Old English rune. So that was the carol that was set in 1948. So as we move along into 1949, my dad joins Alvino Ray's orchestra and with the King Sisters. And they were very popular and they were going all over Heaven Half Acre. Well, there was a pianist and a singer with the group named Jimmy Joyce. And of course, my dad and Jimmy started conversations together. And my dad would talk about Anne, and Jimmy would talk about this lady that he'd worked with named Anne when he was in the Navy in San Diego. So Jimmy and my dad met in Alvino Ray's orchestra, and the Anne they were talking about was my mom. Instant camaraderie. So they continued to tour, and in 1949, the carol for that year was called Sleep Baby Mine. It had two names, also called Carol of the Mother. And my mom was carrying me at that time. And so she and Willa got together in a terrible snowstorm to have dinner and talk about what the lyrics should be, because they would talk about how they wanted to make 1 year more sacred, and 1 year more secular. So Mom is blabbing on about being pregnant and going on and on and on about this. And Willa, being an unmarried lady who was taking care of her mom, was just fascinated by hearing all of this wonderful information. And so they said, would you please do a lullaby? Because we'd like to use it as Diane's birth announcement. They already knew what they were going to call me. And we'd also like to use it for this carol in 1949. So in the conversation before they left, my mom was talking about how wonderful it is for children to see Christ as they are. That it doesn't matter if you're white, black, brown, Asian, Polynesian, it doesn't matter. Children see people as they are. There is no delineation. And this information was something that, as Willa is driving home to Detroit in the snowstorm, she was hit by the words for what would come later as the I have to stop and think, was it 51, I think, carol, Some Children See Him. So she pulled over to the side of the road, and she quickly wrote down all of these lyrics that were coming to her, the poetry, before she could continue on. So in 1949, Sleep Baby Mine was my birth announcement and also the carol of that year. Oh, there I am. My bangs don't do that anymore. I wish they did. And so in 1950, This Is Christmas was my first Christmas that came out. And as we were talking about, 1 year would be sacred, 1 year would be secular. And this one is called Bright, Bright the Holly Berries as well. And it talks about all the trimmings and the tinsel and the gaiety and the beautiful tree and the presents and all the dishes that you have to cook. And my first Christmas, all I was interested in was the tinsel on the tree and the wrapping paper. I did not care what was in the boxes. So this was the first one that I was involved, and my name went on the card. So then the following year, as I was saying, even though the words were done for Some Children See Him, the next carol was in 1951, was Some Children See Him. And as you can see from the picture, they tried to incorporate the different aspects of what the carol is about. And this particular carol has, I think, gone past caroling, or pretty close. Yeah. The two most popular carols in the 15 of the Alfred Burt carols is Caroling, which lots of you can sing right now, and Some Children See Him. And so Some Children See Him was our 1951 carol. Now, granted, we didn't have all this whole computer world and put it on Facebook and send it out on TikTok or whatever. They printed these cards and put them in envelopes and stuck a stamp on them and sent them to friends and family. Well, our mailing list started at about 50 and grew to 450. And my mom used to try and drop a few people off, if you hadn't heard from them for a while, right? And then they'd write and they'd say, I didn't get my card this year. So she had to keep going. So the next carol in 1952 was another one that followed our family Christmases. And it was called Come Dear Children, and nuts to crack and candies to make and birds to stuff and cookies to bake, all the things that are going on. But each one of the carols has a secular verse, but there's also a sacred run. Because in my family, the faith and remembrance of what Christmas is all about was never far away. So that, because they were not commercial, they were a legacy and a labor of love. So when Come Dear Children came out, I was little and I was probably pulling the balls off of the tree. Now back to the fact that Alvino Ray was basing himself out of California, and when I was born in 1950, I was 6 weeks old. My dad couldn't be there, but there was a wonderful rendition on his trumpet played of the song Diane while he was on the road. And then my mom got on a plane and flew to Los Angeles, and we lived in Los Angeles at that point. And there was a piano that had belonged to my grandfather, and it was shipped out to Los Angeles so that it could be there. And it came about the same time that Mom and I were coming from Michigan to Los Angeles. And we were living in an apartment in the San Fernando Valley. If you know the San Fernando Valley where Sepulveda goes, that raceway that heads over the hill. We lost a car there because somebody smashed it up sitting right on the curb. But the piano came, and I arrived, and Mom. And the first thing that we got to do when we went home to the little apartment and the piano had been delivered is my dad went over and he played on and he goes, oh, listen to that. Came all the way across the country and it's not even out of tune. And my mother put her hands on her hips and she says, well, I'm a little out of tune and I came across the country. So I think there was a little makeup time they had to do there. So meanwhile, my father's still working with Alvino Ray. He was also arranging and playing with a group called Horace Heights Orchestra. And Jimmy Joyce was always involved. Betty and Jimmy and my mom and dad were bestest friends. I grew up with all the 5 Joyce boys. And I think I was Betty's surrogate daughter because she kept trying to have a girl. In fact, poor David, he was the youngest. They kept him in curls until he was about 5. He had very curly blonde hair. Anyway, they would go on the road, or they'd go out of town and be away for a few days or a week, and Betty and Mom would keep company with each other, and we kids would play. Well, Mom was tired of living in an apartment, and so was Betty. And they went out to Pacoima, if you know where that is, in the back of the San Fernando Valley, where there were new housing developments. And of course, all of these people were in some form of the military, so they had their GI loans for houses. And Betty and Mom went and bought 2 houses in the housing tract while Jimmy and Dad were out playing jazz music. And when they came back, they said, "Hi, we bought a house." So we moved to Pacoima, and it was a little cute little gray house in the west, and it had put in a trumpet vine in the front, very ironic. And they looked for a church. And the church was a little tiny stable church, if you will. It used to be a stable in the Coldwater Canyon in Studio City. And the stable was converted, and my mom and dad went to that church. And my dad became the assistant choir director, and he would, write things for anthem time or whatever, Christmas, in the middle of his arranging and his travel. Well, when Alvina Ray got a TV show in San Francisco, we temporarily moved up to Oakland to be close to my dad. And they did this show with what was called the Blue Rays, Alvina Ray and the Blue Rays. And the Blue Rays were Marilyn King of the King Sisters, my dad, Jimmy Joyce, and a man by the name of Bryn Bethel. And Bryn was a wonderful musician, and he was part of this whole group, and they would sing, and they would do skits, and it was all very cute. And there was one segment where Marilyn and Dad were singing My Blue Heaven, and on camera with the little apron and the little setup, and Baby Makes 3. Well, I got to be the baby. And the producer, Hi Lesnick, he came to my mom, because my mom was on the set when we were going to do the recording, and said, "Is she going to be all right? Is she going to be quiet?" And she said, "She's a baby. She's going to do what she does, but she's been fed, her diaper's been changed, and she has a cookie, and her dad and Marilyn," I called her Aunt Modi, "she knows these people. I think she'll be fine." So they sang the song, and I'm sitting in a little high chair in the middle, and they're on either side. And they sang the song, and as they finished the song up, and the 2 of them put their arms around me, and the camera panned in, and I went. So my career was born at a very young age. So in 1953, my dad had a very terrible lingering cough, and like a viral infection that he was trying to fight off, even while he was on the road, and he was very tired. And so my mom, being the nurse that she was, says, "Well, you've got to go to the doctor. We have to find out what this is." And unfortunately, he was told that he had lung cancer. And this was the most devastating news for a man who was only 33 years old. So our world turned upside down. They went to New York to get another opinion from the top hospital there at the time, Memorial Hospital. And being back in New York, they decided to go see Me and Juliet, the musical. And during the middle of it, my father, he was having a very hard time, and Mom said, "Let's go." Too much for him,
knowing, I did really well, look how far I got, knowing that he would never write a musical or a huge symphony because the time wouldn't be there. So they flew back, and their goal was to continue that year's carol and also to give me my childhood. That was important. Now I'm going to backtrack just a moment to Come Dear Children. When I was telling you about the Blu-rays from Alvino's show and from being on the road with Alvino Ray, the King Sisters had this wonderful party every year. And when my dad asked the Blu-rays to sing through Come Dear Children to check harmonies and just see how it sounded, they loved it so much, they said, could we sing this at the annual Christmas party for the King Sisters? And he said, sure, go right ahead. Well, they loved the carol. Everybody was very impressed. And so that's when it had officially, if you will, been introduced to the entertainment industry, to the musicians and the singers and the people in the know who went to the King Sister parties. So when they got back after, fast forward to 1953, when they came back from New York, and Jim Conkling, who was the head of Columbia Recordings, Columbia Records, was married to Donna King of the King Sisters. In fact, the parties were mostly at her house, and that was some party, I can tell you. When they heard about the fact, the King Sisters heard about what was happening to my dad, Jim Conkling asked him to do a demo of all the music so that it could be presented to Columbia Records. So all of the professional singers, all the session singers, the Kings, all showed up at the Latter-day Saints church that they went to in North Hollywood and did the demo. And my dad had gotten all the arrangements ready, and at this point, he was actually in a wheelchair, but he wanted to conduct it. And so he was able to conduct the demo session. And that was the most thrilling day of his musical life when he got to do that. And then they turned it into Columbia Records, and Columbia Records gave him a contract. The 1953 carol, O Hearken Ye, was very, very uplifting, joyful and spiritual, and keeping everybody pulled together. My father had a wonderful sense of humor. On the little wheelchair that he had an ooga horn, and he was playing the piano one day, and he hit the horn while he was playing, and it went, right? So then he started playing the Danube Waltz, da 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 da, da da. I think we have that on tape. And he kept everything light. Now, because of my mother's background in the medical world, my father was at home. They turned their master bedroom into a hospital room for him with a hospital bed so he would be comfortable. They put a little table and chairs by the TV, so I would go and have dinner with my dad every night. And there was only one thing that happened. When we would have dinner, the Clarabelle from the Howdy Doody show drove my father crazy. And then there was also Rin Tin Tin. I think it was first Howdy Doody and then Rin Tin Tin. So my dad asked my mom, he said, do you think we could change the dinner hour to a half hour later? She said, why? What's the problem? He says, I can't stand Clarabelle. I'll watch Rin Tin Tin, but could we just change it to... So by half an hour, we shifted forward. My father continued writing because they asked Willa Hudson if she would do some extra lyrics because they wanted a few more up-tempo songs to put on the upcoming recording. Therefore, next one, please. Caroling, Caroling was written in 1954, but it wasn't a card. And also, We'll Dress the House was not a card. In 1954, the last card done was, it's the Star Carol, but the cover was called The Christmas Mood. And I will give you that information. Willa knew she was losing her writing partner. So she wrote Caroling, Caroling, and she wrote We'll Dress the House. And the Star Carol were, again, words that came to her just because she knew she was losing him. So the last card that he wrote was the Star Carol. 2 days before he died on February 7th. On February 5th, Jimmy was over and he was playing through the carol for him before Mom put it all together. And my dad said, you need to change the tenor note in the last 4 bars. Always the professor, always staying on top of the music. And then we lost him on February 7th. But he was home the whole time. He was home with us. And Columbia Records put the card out that year. And go to the next one. It was all color and beautiful, and the little girl is not me. Everybody thinks it is. I don't know why they didn't ask me. But it was a wonderful photographer who worked with Columbia who did that card. So that card went out. My mom put that card out with just our names, saying that the legacy had ended and now the world had the music. Because an hour after my mother got home after my father died, the completed contract from Columbia Records arrived. And she knew that in 1954, that Christmas, those carols would be on a recording. Whew. And we have CDs for you, if you're interested, that will be out in the lobby that you can take a look of, along with our beautiful boards of the replicas of the original carols. Now, if you have any questions, I'd love to answer them for you, but I also know that some of you might need to use the facilities. And I hope I've given you enough of an idea of who he was. Thank you. Do you have any questions?